question all of our viewers today want to hear is, where does George Will, chief conservative spokesman, stand? Do you want to strike them now, George?
No,
Do you want to wear that badge, George?
Well, I'll whatever Sam says, I agree with on that. But,
Thanks for staying up later. George Will is back. This is his latest book, Suddenly, a collection of his essays from 1986 up until the last few months. But before we talk about that, we got to go back to our last conversation, which was exclusively about baseball. At that time, Men at Work was riding at the top of the bestseller list. And what are we to make now of the George Will curse? There were 4 primary sources for your book about baseball, and they all met an evil fate at one time or another in 1990. Oral Hershiser, the rotator cuff. Tony Gwynn barely bats .300, which for him is substandard, gets into fights with his teammates, and leaves a very unhappy man at the end of the season. Tony La Russa's A's don't achieve dynasty status. They get swept 4 straight by Cincinnati. And Cal Ripken, although he still hasn't missed a game since Hector was a pup, falls into a batting slump and actually hears boos in Baltimore. Who are we to blame but you?
exactly. I'm the Sports Illustrated cover. I carry this black cloud with me and ruin people's lives. But they'll all be back next year.
Men at Work stayed at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for 19 weeks. One of, if not the greatest performance by a sports book ever. Now that the dust is settled, what do you make of the reaction to the book?
My life is over. I mean, that's essentially, it's all downhill from here. But I mean, I wrote the book that no one had written for me because I wanted to know those things. And I just think that there were a lot of people who were thinking as I was. Gee, I wish I knew that.
Generally speaking, the critical response to the book was overwhelmingly positive, but I've noticed, as you have, in the last couple of months, that some people within the sports writing fraternity seem to have turned on you.
Well, that happens when you're high up there. You're a good target to shoot at. And also, I sort of broke the guild rules that one of them was supposed to do it, maybe. I welcome it. Go out and do it. Write another interesting book.
Has it been helpful to have written a best-selling book about baseball and the occasional columns you'll write about going to a Bruce Springsteen or Rolling Stones concert, or your favorite flavor of ice cream, or even one you wrote about your son Jonathan, who has Down syndrome, and his affection for a small dog? Do those things serve to humanize you? Because I'm sure I'm not the first to tell you that the first impression of you might be, here's the brightest guy in the class. And almost nobody likes the brightest guy in the class, unless he's also the best football player.
Yeah, that's right. No, it does make me a little harder to hate, I hope, but that's not why I do it. In fact, if I don't write a third of my columns off the news, I'm not doing my job right. By off the news, I don't just mean below the fold on the front page of the paper. I mean on stories that aren't in the paper. Because I write, I'm a Washington writer. I live in Washington, but I write about all kinds of things. Television, books, education, culture, children, movies, these affect the quality of life. That's my beat, as it were. It's not who's going to win the New Hampshire primary. Who knows, who cares? I'm much more interested in the things beyond politics that shape what kind of children we raise. And that's the most important thing any of us are ever going to do, is raise children. And that's what I'm interested in, is the enveloping culture in which they live.
What did you take away from the Springsteen concert? You liked him, as I recall.
Headache. I did like him, actually. I mean, he puts on a wonderful show. And what interested me is that the audience there was in its sort of early 30s. These are sort of grown-ups there. Some of them, no doubt, had children of their own coming along. And it was just a tremendously nice atmosphere.
Did you feel uncomfortable there?
Well, I should not have worn a coat and tie, but I'd never.
I could have told you that, George.
Yeah, well, you didn't, and so I felt like a damn fool. Yes, but no, it was great fun. I got there, and I went there because Max Weinberg, who was the drummer in the East Street Band, liked the Brinkley Show and had read some of my books and said, "Come along." And I got there, and his wife said, "Oh, here's some cotton for your ears." She knew, so I put the cotton in my ears, which made it a little more bearable.
There's something at the center of a lot of Springsteen's work that's very American.
Oh, absolutely.
About the loyalty to the hometown and the feeling of hard work being rewarded and staying true to certain values.
That's right. Oh, absolutely. No, it was... he had that Born in the USA phenomenon and tour and album and all the rest at about the same time of the Los Angeles Olympics. At about the same time, Reagan carried 49 states with the It's Morning in America theme. That was historians, I think, will remember that as a tour itself and Springsteen as one of the symptoms of a kind of apogee of American cheerfulness.
Although he was troubled when Reagan embraced him and when people in his mind misinterpreted what Born in the USA was about. His point was that a lot of people born in the USA and bred on the American dream were disenfranchised and disillusioned.
That's right. And then he got also trouble when the Mondale campaign said, fine, endorse us. And he says, I'm not in the endorsing business.
Now, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream, and why has this given you so much trouble?
It's my favorite. There's only one correct flavor of ice cream. It's vanilla. Everyone knows that.
You're only saying that because I know your favorite flavor has a real cute name, and you couldn't bring yourself to say it, so you have to deprive it, unless you send the henchman out to get a bag of it, right?
It's not a flavor of ice cream. It's a thing. It's a vanilla. You mean Nutty Buddies?
Yeah.
Wonderful thing. It's dipped in chocolate and then covered with nuts. But, I mean, how can a grown-up go in and ask a 16-year-old girl, I want a Nutty Buddy? I mean, it's embarrassing.
Why don't you send Sam to do it for you?
That's a thought.
You and Sam are constantly at odds, but it's obvious that you like each other too much to really haul off and belt one another.
Well, it's like Washington at its best. Things are not personal. That you have serious arguments and then you go your separate ways. That politics isn't consuming in that way. Otherwise, that small town would blow apart.
I'm not the first to make this observation, certainly, but part of the reason why it works is that you seem to argue mostly from scholarship. There's often some historical precedent for your point of view, or there's a relevant quotation, and he seems to have it come from the gut.
Well, Sam is a sort of visceral guy. I mean, he's been around Washington longer than I have. He's been a wonderful, industrious, extraordinarily hardworking journalist who does, as a lot of journalists do and must, operating on the severe deadlines that he's operating on. He forms quick judgments, strong passions, and acts on them.
And I am surprised, frankly, coming back here. You read the papers, what I've missed. There's been a war psychosis here. People are predicting 36 hours we're going to strike. Are we going to strike it within 48 hours? What nonsense.
Well,
we don't have the forces there to strike.
There's a sense that it would be a short war.
Why are we doing this?
Oh, yeah? Short war, my tocus.
Well, exactly.
It just seems to me a lot of people in this town and a lot of people on the air have just reveled in the idea that we're going to war, toughness, that the American eagle has talons on his claws. And I'd like to say to those people, including some of my colleagues in this business, if you feel that strongly, why don't you lead the charge?
Well, let's talk about some great or near great moments on This Week with David Brinkley. How about the time that Ernest Hollings from South Carolina was being questioned by Sam Donaldson, and Sam says, I understand you get your suits, you're a well-dressed man, you get your suits from a Korean tailor, and Hollings was either ready or very quick.
I think he was both. Hollings is quick, he has a terrific temper, and he's exploded on the Senate floor before, and he went after Sam.
He said, yeah, I think I get my suits from the same place you get your wig.
Yeah, well, it was not fair comment, I think.
What was the atmosphere like on the set? Because I noticed that Brinkley quickly went to a commercial, and then in the round table afterwards, that never came up.
Well, I was embarrassed, and I think David was also, that this kind of exchange would occur on the show, that it was an ad hominem remark by Fritz Hollings, who I happen to think is one of the brightest and best senators, but that was unworthy of him.
A moment I'm sure you're proud of, though, happened when Ferdinand Marcos was on the show, and you asked him point blank, all right, look, let's not beat around the bush. Would you go for snap elections in the Philippines?
Yeah, and I think I may have mentioned before, maybe I haven't, that that was a setup. I was called by Senator Laxalt, who had been sent as an emissary from the Reagan administration to the Philippines as this crisis deepened, and he called me on a Saturday at home and said, George, if you ask about this, you might get an interesting answer. Some people here who wonder if it is not possible and if you would not be willing to move up the election date, it's the better to renew your mandate soon, say within the next 8 months or so. Is that possible that you could have an election earlier than scheduled?
I am decided that with these suggestions coming from the opposition and now in this show and interview, I'm ready. I'm ready to call a snap election.
Again, it shows you something about the dominance of America and of this medium, that the president of the Philippines decided to call an election on Sunday morning television in America.
What has television meant to you?
Well,
how has it changed your life?
I think it helps the writing. I'm a writer who does television. I'm not a television person. But I think it helps because it makes me more interesting to more people who then want to read my columns and books, which is that's the heart of my life.
Your hands feel colder when you leave your home. Don't your eyes look older when you make...
Is part of the reason why you have so little sympathy for George Bush simply that he's not Ronald Reagan?
No, that has nothing to do with it. He's the 41st president, and 39 others haven't been Ronald Reagan. And there have been better presidents than Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, by the way, is not my sort of #1 pinup. I dedicated my book to Scoop Jackson. He was a Democrat. He was the only real political hero I've had in Washington in 20 years. My complaint with George Bush is that I don't think he appreciates the majesty of politics, the grandeur of talking to the American people, of summoning the better angels of their nature, as Lincoln said. It was very telling and to me very depressing when the President Bush said in a sort of one of those impromptu news conferences of his, that sort of a stream of semi-consciousness, where he said, you know, I'm really much more comfortable, happy, pleased, dealing with foreign policy than having to go up and deal with Danny Rostenkowski and all these domestic matters. Well, first place, Americans live here in America. They're more concerned, and ought to be in a way more concerned about their problems here at home. Second, Lord knows we've got enough. Third, all the really lasting and interesting questions of political life are about domestic affairs: justice, equality, fraternity, rule of law, constitutionalism. They all arise out of national lives. Not international relations, or great game theory, certain prudential rules, but it's not very intellectually exciting. And to me, it's very depressing when a president seeks kind of solace and distraction abroad.
And yet, even with the budget crisis and with the S&L problems and everything else domestically, it would appear that the best opportunity for him to define himself in his first term comes in the Middle East.
All presidents feel that way. Remember, they all flee abroad. Lyndon Johnson, it's a curious case. Lyndon Johnson was the one president who said, I'm a poor boy from Texas. I understand the South. I understand poverty. I understand race. I want to concentrate on great society programs. And he was dragged, kicking and screaming, into foreign affairs and a distraction that eventually broke his presidency. No question that George Bush now, in the Persian Gulf, is going to rise or fall. And he could rise high and fall very fast and far on that deployment.
You once called Bush a lapdog. That was early on as he was emerging as...
January 1986.
Okay, so and since then, other disparaging comments have followed. Does he have any sense that this is all in the rough and tumble of politics, so when he sees you, he slaps you on the back, or is he ticked off?
I don't have that feeling. No, I don't blame him. Look, if someone were writing about me, the sort of things I'm writing about him, I'd be very cross.
What does he say? Or does he simply not talk to you?
We don't see one another. No, we used to. For a while we did.
Did you see him post lapdog?
Only on the Brinkley show set in the Iowa caucuses.
And what did he say?
We were very polite.
Just civil.
Hello. One of those. But,
it stings, obviously, much worse coming from you than if Tom Wicker called him a lapdog.
Yeah, well, I think, frankly, it stung because it was true. What I said was, I was commenting on the way he was campaigning, that he was, I thought, going from group to group, saying what they wanted to hear, trying to be all things to all people. And that is a continuing criticism of mine. It goes to his style of politics. It's a substantive, not a personal criticism.
And if there seems to be one thing that really gets under your skin of late. It's George Bush's attempt to, in your view, to identify where the consensus is and move as quickly toward that as possible.
Yes, I once in an intemperate moment called him the weather vane of the Western world, that the wind shoves him around too much. It's not in his interest. It's not in any politician's interest to be too positive, too popular. Once you polarize, make people choose, you're going to shave something off the top of your popularity, but you're going to harden the base under you. See, Ronald Reagan could get in trouble, and he did over Iran-Contra and a recession. He'd fall down to here. There was 35% of the country that was with Ronald Reagan forever, no matter what. When a Jimmy Carter got in trouble, it was free fall, because there was no if you said, what's a Carter Democrat? People said, oh, I'm not quite sure. People knew what a Reagan Republican was.
Now, how much of that foundation of support for Reagan could truly be attributed to his ideas, which obviously a certain number of his supporters embraced, and how much to his personal charisma and the fact that he seemed such a genial man that even when we knew he was either off base or, in the case of Iran-Contra, alarmingly detached from what was going on, we basically figured, he's too nice a guy to lambaste. Nixon we could lambaste, this guy we can't.
85% of his ideas, only 15% charm. Ronald Reagan...
You've got it down to those exact percentages.
Well, just about. I mean, in the sense that when Ronald Reagan got in trouble during the '82 recession, the worst contraction since the Depression, his popularity went down like that. People in America still insist on performance. You talk about Nixon. Man, utterly without charm. No rapport at all with the American people in that sense. More people have voted for Richard Nixon for president than anyone in history. He got enormous numbers of votes because people listened to him and said, you know, basically I agree with him. The American electorate is not composed of silly people. When Reagan ran, said, do three things. Cut your taxes, stop inflation, going to rearm America in the hope that we can crack the Soviet will to conduct the Cold War. I think he did all three, basically. Look, there are problems. Of course, he didn't make the world perfect. Basically, that's not a bad record.
Now on to the latest book, Suddenly. If there's a broad theme here in this collection of essays, it seems to be this, that American ideas have triumphed abroad as they disintegrate at home.
Well, certainly the American ideas swept the field abroad. We had an argument that enlivened the intellectual life of the Western world for 2 centuries, 1789 with the French Revolution and the extremism it gave rise to, eventually, I believe, totalitarianism. Those who believe that society should be run from above by the commands of a small minority claiming a monopoly on the understanding of history. And the American idea, others have had it. We didn't invent it entirely, but we express it best and most clearly. And it is free men, free markets, political and social pluralism, government of limited, enumerated, and delegated powers. Basically, the institutional arrangements in which we live. The world wants it. The world hungers for it. The old arguments that used to wax and wane don't wax and wane anymore. We divided the city of Berlin, the country of Germany, the continent of Europe, faced the two ideas off. The results are in. It's over. We won. But at home, the discipline, the exacting craft of democracy is falling into disrepair. Not disrepute. People still understand the values, still like the process, but they look at the government and they say, this is not working. We're not living up to the ideals.
Just one symptom, the low voter turnouts.
That's right. You can explain low voter turnouts in a lot of ways. In part, it's contentment. You know, you want to live in a society where people don't feel a passionate need to vote. People voted like mad in late Weimar Germany and in the early 1930s because the outcome of the election decided who did and who did not go to concentration camps. We don't want to live in a society where people vote because life is turned upside down by election results. On the other hand, people increasingly in this country don't vote because either they're angry or there's no competition. If you go out and vote, you want to say, well, that's a hot race. I'd like to influence that. Well, when 96, 97, 98% of incumbents are getting reelected at the national level, people say, what difference does it make? And they're rational to say that. So there's a lot of out of sync here. That's why you see this extraordinary movement, and I think will be the hot issue of the mid-90s, which is to limit the terms people can serve in legislatures.
Do you think it will be successful?
I shouldn't be surprised. They've limited them in Kansas City, Oklahoma, Colorado, and California. I mean, 1 in 9 American voters lives in California. And they passed a quite draconian limit. They're going to sweep out all incumbents in the next 6 or 7 years. It's extraordinary.
Last question. Is Dan Quayle beyond rehabilitation?
Politically, I think it's very likely that he is. I don't think the public impression of him is quite fair, but it's very hard to see how you get out from under this. He's being treated very well as vice president by George Bush, who, having been a vice president, knows the difficulty of the job. He's evidently contributed very well to some of the, and given very good advice in some of these crises, domestic and foreign. But it's very hard for me to see how he digs out from under this, aided, even though he is by, and I think there's almost a general consensus on this, by one of the best staffs in Washington.
Is this all just misfortune, or to a certain extent does he deserve it? Is he not up to the job?
Well, he was not quite ready for prime time when all this fell on him that afternoon in New Orleans. But again, that's often the way we treat and pick vice presidents.
Here's how he always comes across to me. He always seems like not the brightest kid in the class, a reasonably bright, very diligent kid who has been well prepped, and now it's his turn to step to the podium at the school assembly.
I don't think he was well prepped. I don't think that anything in his life prepared him for the kind of rigorous thinking and hard application that goes into life at the top of the American political pyramid. And in fact, he said as much during the campaign when I talked to him. He said, nothing in life prepared me for this. Look, no one who plays golf that well, and I mean this quite seriously, no one who's quite that good at golf has spent enough time doing other things, reading books and going through some of the hardships and discipline of life. You a golfer?
Certainly not.
Good.
I've spent too much time reading books.
That's the spirit.
This is George Will's latest book, Suddenly. This was his second visit. I think it's safe to say that he'll be back. Until then, see you later.
Thank you.